life differently due to privileged or marginalized identities and intersections of those identities.
Hmm. I think that's been one of the hardest things in the last few months has been, well, maybe the last year or so actually, has been staying up with the news
Mm,
because it's like so painful.
right.
And you know, I want to just kind of like check out. Like, I don't want to know what's happening. And I remember my husband pulled up a video for me um, of, I believe it was sort of like a police shooting. And I was like, I don't want to see it. And I sort of caught myself because I thought, there's so much stuff going on that I don't have to see. Part of
Mhm.
that is, I talked about the privilege of being a counseling psychologist, that I'm in this really comfortable, amazing space where, and I'm surrounded, at Auburn with other folks that are committed to social justice and care about these issues. And so I could really just shut down and stay in this bubble and feel
Mhm.
really comfortable and relaxed. But a lot of folks don't get to do that. And there are a lot of folks right now that are being directly threatened. Um, I right now have the privilege that I don't feel directly threatened by what's happening
Mhm.
um, in the world today, but there are a lot of folks that are directly threatened. They don't get to just step away or close their eyes or say they don't want to see it. And so that has been, I think, a personal push for me in my own social justice practices to pay attention. You don't get to quit. You don't get to bow out. You don't get to pretend it's not happening. It is happening. And there are a lot of folks that can't pretend.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. That's amazing, Evelyn. I'm just so appreciating you right now. I feel the need to say that. Um,
Thank you, Britt.
it's taking
You
a
know I
lot for
love
me
you.
not to like start like cheering right now. I'm getting like totally amped, so I'm gonna calm myself down a little bit. But I think about like world traveling and how, like you were saying, how we're constantly traveling in and out of worlds that feel comfortable and uncomfortable, and recognizing the different emotions and ways of being that each world brings up in each of us. And that notion of world traveling also um, moves people to the margins, and what it feels like to be in the margins where, and literally in today, having those margins being heavily patrolled, as in who can enter and who can't. Um, and for those individuals who are not being able to enter spaces because of ICE, because of executive orders, recognizing the comfort that I have and not having to worry about that,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the many ways that are less direct that we are monitoring and policing borders, and
Mm-hmm.
who are those in the margins in our classroom, in our sessions, in our institutions, in our families.
I know one of the things, just as you talk about that, I encouraged in one of my classes um, was for students to reach out to someone who's currently being directly affected. And it really goes back to something you said earlier, Britt, about the relationships being really important to feel challenged in our own privileged spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so many of us don't have folks in our spaces, in our close community that are being directly challenged. And so it gets easy to sort of shut down. So sort of pushing into that and saying, I'm going to, um, reach out, ask questions. How can I help? What can I do? What will be um, beneficial? Um, I think it's really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
All right, so
I,
I
okay.
don't want to interrupt, but we are getting some questions, so I wanted
Awesome.
to
Yeah.
start fielding some of them to you. One question, actually, is kind of I don't want to say controversial, but might be a really interesting one. Recently, there were some protests at Berkeley You know, some fires were burned. Really, there was a lot of backlash towards someone named Milo. I don't want to call the last name, but I was curious about what you thought about that role, because I've heard different people say, there's no room for violence, right?
Mm.
I think about like our ethical code, right? And we're not supposed to tear stuff up, right? So I was curious as to how you think about those issues of violence and nonviolence in the movement. I think the people who were burning stuff down said, you know, Milo would have spoken otherwise, and they felt like there was so much harm. And then I've got a lot of other questions that will follow from the audience. So audience, hang on there. We'll get to them. But that's the first one for you.
Perfect. So thank you for that question. And I know that when we were talking about the Women's March earlier, one of the things that I left with and saying was we had all of these people and there were no arrests. And that was the first reaction that I had, that we had people internationally and there were absolutely no arrests. And going back to our earlier conversation, Evelyn, of many different ways of doing activism. And there was part of me that really wanted all of the individuals who participated in the Women's March for women not to play into the very gendered expectations of being passive and having this one day that we're going to come together and then leave. There was part of me that just really wanted all of the people to occupy Trump's whole first week and just like sit in on Washington. So I was feeling disappointed that that didn't happen, and also, and this is where the both and comes in, and also recognizing that the space was very clearly a space where many children were, many individuals with different abilities, and being cognizant that there's a both and there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's such a great question, and I think violence and nonviolence, this question has been around since, you know, in the history, you know, since activism has existed. But what I think about is that I don't know of a protest space that comes without some sort of objection.
Mm-hmm.
When protests are nonviolent, there is objection. You know, don't kneel. That's disrespectful. When protests are violent, there's objection. And I think it really just goes back to we all have a different place where we're called to be of impact. And sometimes, I think somebody said to me, Britt, it may have been you, I'm not sure, but somebody said to me, sometimes you got to burn shit down.
It was me.
I mean, was it you, Britt?
It was me, yeah.
Quoting Britt.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
should I be like the Grammys and put up, you know, some type of censor?
Yeah, put a
I
timer
know.
on.
That's it on a webinar. Oh my gosh.
Okay. Okay.
Or maybe I said it first. I'm not sure.
Collectively, we were all thinking that.
Sorry, guys. But, you know, there's this question of, you know, where is that person's calling, and where is the most impact? And I think, you know, I hate to be a judge of another person's social justice practice, and it feels like a disservice to the work that's really, really hard work to do. So.
Okay, well, thank you. And I think attendees are enjoying kind of the intimate conversation you had, so thank you. Here's some other questions. In terms of people who say they espouse these social justice values, and they share these values but maybe aren't as active, how do you work with folks to stay more active, encourage them to be more active? And there's a kind of follow-up question about what does this all look like in the counseling session? And I know we have people on the webinar from lots of different helping disciplines.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things to encourage more activism is to broaden our definition of activism, which I think we've talked a little bit about before, that it's not just protest attendance, it's not necessarily just writing, it's not necessarily sort of committee work, it can be literally anything from as, a small of action of where do I spend my $5 for lunch, to, what conversation am I going to bring up at, I know in my family, Christmas dinner, to, we had a no politics rule, and so that was funny,
Did it last?
at Christmas dinner. Oh, yeah, right. 5 minutes. So broadening that understanding of activism, I think that's been sort of evolving for me too, understanding that the small is just as important as the big. There was a second part to that question. I think, Britt, I might let you.
I think the second one was really about like what does it look like in session with
Mhm.
when you're doing counseling with clients.
Sure. So I think that this is a very complex question, again, because I really want to value the many ways in which we all do different forms of therapy as well as different forms of social justice. But I can give an example of something that I've done, and then also knowing that there are many ways in which many of us are practicing from different theoretical orientations and ways of incorporating. So I want to preface by saying that. So one thing that happened to me was right after the election, I had several clients coming in and they were really distressed, and for good reason. And as a clinician, I was recognizing that their academics were falling, and I was in this place where I was feeling a tension between not wanting to minimize their struggle and also recognizing that there are things that still need to be done. So it was really just about being transparent and saying, I get it. This world seems like it's falling apart, and you're still in these classes, and you still want to graduate, and you still have these goals. So how do we work with this without minimizing your experience? And I'm a fan of authenticity and transparency in session, as well as having clients ask me, are you racist? Having clients ask me about my sexual identity, having clients ask me about ways in which I practice social justice, and being open to answering those questions so that they know that it's not something that I just preach in session and don't actually do.
Awesome. Thank you. And we've got a really good one here. For this person, they say, we've had some challenging systemic conversations recently about diversity at our counseling center, and supervisory administrative power and privilege have been highlighted. How do you challenge power dynamics and privilege when those in power are culturally privileged as well?
Mm. That's a fabulous question.
Yeah. You guys came with the heavy hitters.
I know, shoot.
It's a great question. So I think one thing is it's first sort of identifying the culture of the space you're in. It sounds like if there are conversations already going on, that's a really good sign. And there are spaces that I think we have to acknowledge where there aren't conversations going on, and those issues of power and privilege still exist. But I think as sort of a trainee or an ECP, being able to think about ways in which you can build a support network with folks that maybe are in some of those positions of power and privilege, to help sort of frame that conversation can be really helpful. The other thing I think is just sharing that experience, sort of being authentic about, I really want to have these conversations around challenging power and privilege, but I realize I don't feel that I hold much in this space. And the hope is that there's that you're in a space where those that do hold some power can sort of respond to that. But even if you're not, I think that can be a subtle challenge in and of itself, to just being able to say, I want this to be a part of our conversation, but I don't feel safe about that right now.
I agree with everything you just said, Evelyn. And I think that the only thing I would add to that, and it probably is just saying the same thing, would be within those supports to recognize who has a little bit more privilege and who doesn't. So for instance, ECPs and trainees are in a very precarious position within systems. So having those supports and being willing to hear the voices of those with less privilege within the system, as well as advocating in a way that isn't othering. So for instance, one thing that I've experienced in my many years of being involved in different systems is saying we want to hear from all voices. And I feel like it's a genuine invitation. And I've also paid attention to whose voices are heard after those invitations. And I think that just being observant and being aware and practicing the social justice that the system seems, in this case, seems to be committed to, but actually practicing it in the microcosm of the smaller system of the counseling center within the larger institution and within the larger systems of the U.S.
I love that. And I think sometimes it might mean taking a step back, even as sort of an ECP or trainee, to model what that looks like to use your privilege in those spaces.
For sure.
I think one of the things we've learned, and we're all in the subcommittee on social action in Division 17, and we have full professors who are in that group who really lead. So I think working with people in power to bring attention to some of those things and using data is really important. There's something called the action continuum. You can Google it. And as a system, you can kind of start a conversation about where you are in the action continuum. Are you doing anything, nothing, or something in terms of prevention? Here's a follow-up question that kind of goes in the same vein. What theories and or frameworks do you personally use to understand your position or role in social justice movements? So are there any theories or frameworks that guide you?
I think I'm sort of guided in life from a more interpersonal framework in general. So sort of just, I just truly believe that we really change in relationships. And so when I think about social justice, both the action that I'm taking, but also when I'm challenging others to take more action, I think about being able to do that in the context of a relationship. So getting involved with folks you don't know, with experiences that you don't have experience with, building like authentic relationships, authentic friendships that go beyond sort of these surface level identity descriptions, but really sort of engaging in experiences with people. And I think that is the big idea of a framework. So for instance, if I do go to a march, I like to meet people there, hear stories there, attempt to build connections, and both to sort of have more supportive folk around me, but then also just to hear stories and to sort of be made aware.
I love that you brought the personal into that, because this is an area of tension for me, in that I feel like theories are so incredibly important, and we really need to applaud our scholars, our academics who continue to do the important work of providing us with frameworks. And we also need to honor those practitioners who aren't providing those theories, but are practicing them on a day-to-day basis, and being willing to learn from interdisciplinary texts, reading up on feminist philosophy, grabbing Audre Lorde, even just engaging in novels, and really engaging with the protagonist in novels, and what does it mean for them to evolve, and having that be of equal weight to some of the theories that we use and really validate.
I love that.
Thank you. And I think a follow-up question to the counseling center question was, this person is asking how social justice can be implemented in other ways at a counseling center outside of the counseling sessions. So, for instance, this person's counseling center just had a meeting regarding what they can do as a center regarding the recent political climate, and I think that's a pretty active discussion that's happening right now. So what are the systemic ways you can build that into counseling centers? And I know, Britt, you're at a counseling center right now.
I am. I am. So I am very fortunate. So UPenn CAPS has such a strong social justice model to our training, and it's really something that's practiced quite extensively. And I'm looking around my desk to see if I have the actual pamphlet. But we've been meeting on a weekly basis following the Women's March in writing postcards as a staff to our congressmen about issues that are important to us, thanking those Congress persons who are supporting issues that are important to us, as well as challenging those to not endorse any of the candidates. I'm trying to be diplomatic, so I'm holding back and I'm struggling for words. Challenging those things in their larger political climate that we're really opposed to, and allowing there to be differences of opinions in that as well, but really coming together as a collective unit to support each other, to advocate for what's important in the larger socio-political climate, as well as the socio-political climate at the academic institution as well. So through outreach, through other ways of being involved in the community. One of the things that our training center does in our outreach program is that we actually are involved with one of the public schools in Philadelphia, and that's our outreach project, where we're working with the school to identify needs and how we can best help them, and being willing to step outside of the box and thinking about outreach. I don't know if you have anything to add, Evelyn.
You are the expert here, but one thing I would add is also thinking about the space in the counseling center and what messages are accessible in that space, be it on doors, be it in pamphlets, be it sort of around, in those general waiting areas, what messages are being sent about what's going on. And I think it's so great that counseling centers are talking about how to get involved, because what's happening politically is happening to clients. And so so there's not a neutral stance. I mean, it's happening. And so sort of thinking about how to craft the space so that clients see the counseling center is engaged.
And I think one of the things you can do is, because this webinar is being recorded, you can bring this webinar back to your counseling center, watch it with your interns and your staff. And also one strategy I've seen is kind of working with student groups and maybe client-focused groups about what is needed in a time, so that it's actually driven by client voices. Our next question is going off the current question regarding what social justice looks like in the counseling session. This person is curious, how do you manage being an ally when working with clients who voice clear prejudices? So how do you manage that? What are the ethics behind addressing or not addressing those prejudices?
That is a good question. It's actually something that I've been struggling with a little bit. I think the first thing is to try to find some empathy, and that has felt really, really hard recently, but I think it's so important. And if we think about who we want to impact in social justice practice, I think it's twofold. I think we want to impact those who are oppressed, but we also want to impact oppressors. We want folks to stop oppressing people. And so I think that's sort of who your question's aimed at. And I think it starts with sort of trying to build some empathy around where those prejudices happen. And then I think in most clinical relationships, once you can kind of locate the pain center of those things, where they came from, and be really empathetic, then there's room to engage them. I think if we are social justice advocates in our identities as clinicians, then engaging them is what is the expectation that should happen. The question is, how does it happen therapeutically? And I think that's sort of the ethical piece there, is to ensure that when I do engage, it's therapeutically, it's for the client.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that another thing that we need to recognize in this question is the difference between visible and invisible identities. in that I have the privilege that I can be assumed to be an ally of more conservative racist ideologies because of my perceived whiteness, which is a correct perception, whereas other individuals who are people of color don't have that privilege, and they're going to be assumed automatically to be anti what the client is saying, and that's a very different conversation that happens, and as well as a different experience that the clinician experiences, the overt isms versus the assumed joining of those isms at times. But you are exactly right that it has to be for the client, not our own needs. So as much as you would like to challenge them, trying your best to find that vulnerability and tie it back in with presenting concerns I mean, I really want to just say how challenging it is. And it also is a way that I feel like practitioners are engaging in social justice on a day-to-day.
Absolutely.
I think what you're both saying makes me think about our ethics code, and that may be behind what the participant is asking too, is we do feel ethically kind of compromised in those situations because we're, you know, commanded really by our ethics code to do no harm. So when we don't speak or, you know, address things, it can feel really uncomfortable. So it's a great question to get more consultation and supervision on. So thank you for your responses. Given the current political climate, you both referred to this very much so in your conversation. There are so many different social justice issues that this person is saying need our attention. So how do you balance this call between all these different social justice issues that are coming pretty rapidly and your commitments to those social justice issues? And just as a time note, we've got about 5 minutes left, so if there are any last questions for our attendees, go in and send those in.
Mm-hmm. I think that, as Evelyn said earlier, really being cognizant of why we're prioritizing certain commitments over others, as well as recognizing our own limitations. So recognizing that we need to take care of ourselves as well. And I always think about the Audre Lorde quote about self-care and self-compassion and how that is so important to the resistance and to social justice, because we need to be supportive of each other and supportive of ourselves. And as an introvert myself, recognizing that I need that space to recharge. Yeah. I'm trying to be concise because I'm aware of time.
Yeah, I think I've used the phrase intentionality a lot today, and that's really, I mean, it's really the space I'm in right now in terms of my own social justice practice, in that trying to be more intentional about where I engage and also where I'm not engaging, and just as Britt said, sort of confronting that and making sure it's from a good space. I don't think any of us can attend to everything that's happening. It wouldn't be healthy to do so, and we probably wouldn't be very effective in terms of our advocacy. But I think if we can be intentional about where we engage and how we're using our strengths, we can have the most impact.
Mm-hmm. And I had a mentor, based on what you're saying, I had a mentor tell me 5 minutes a day, Annalise, that's it, 5 minutes a day.
All
I was like, really? Only 5 minutes? But he would always remind me that that 5 minutes adds up, and sometimes the 5 minutes is taking care of yourself. So this person is asking, as a white clinician and clinical supervisor, one of the things I grapple with is how to signal openness to feedback. I often encounter white guilt, and also the colleagues and supervisors of color have a desire to take care of me in that process. Do you have thoughts on how to approach this? So good. Such a good question.
A really good question. I think one thing that's been really helpful for me in my experiences has been white folk being willing to say, it's okay, don't take care of me. And I think that's sometimes really hard to do, but it's been so freeing for me. and it's an immediate message for me of like this person gets it. Like
Mm-hmm.
they realize that there's sort of a burden around me needing to lift them up in these moments.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think that's one thing. I think it's amazing that you're recognizing that, and I think that's one thing that can really be helpful is being able to verbalize. I don't need to be taken care of. I realize this is my stuff. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that this is where, as Annalise said, lots of consultation, lots of supervision, and as Evelyn said, just finding those communities who can push you to grow, as well as doing some of your own self-exploration and reading up on white fragility. And I even think about like there's been a watering down of what calling out means, and that you shouldn't call out, you should call in. And for me, that's just like you're taking care of the more privileged individual. Like, no, you should be able to be called out, and the space should be open for those who are being oppressed to be able to call out,
mhm,
um, because the space is for those who are more privileged. So being okay, trying to work on being okay with that discomfort and knowing that that discomfort is where growth occurs.
mhm.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. I mean, I just want to give you a round of applause and thank you for letting us into your dialogue with one another. I think this is how we make social justice change is through conversations with one another and learning. And I know it's been such an honor to be here with you both. I feel like I've learned so much. I want to give a shout out to the both of you and also let attendees know that our next webinar, which is also free, is coming up on March 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It's exploring taking action against anti-Semitism and intergenerational dialogue. It's also an interfaith dialogue. I think it'll be a really complex topic that we're ready to dig into. And then on April 17th at 12 p.m. Eastern, we'll have our next webinar, Infusing Trans Issues into Counseling and Psychology, Supervision and Training, Dialogues between Supervisees and Supervisors. So again, thank you, Dr. Hunter. Thank you, Britt. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you both.
Yeah.
And we also want to give a warm shout out to Heather, who's our Division 17 contact, keeping
Thanks,
us
Heather.
organized behind the scenes, and to the fantastic Debbie Nolan, who is really wonderful. So for everyone, I hope you take away a little piece of this conversation as an inspiration for the next steps on the journey. It's a long one, but it's one that is very much needed. So take care of yourselves, take care of one another, and keep taking action. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Britt.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Night.